When the master went into the great ancestral temple, he asked questions about everything that took place. Someone said, "Who said that his son of a man from Zoo understands ritual?" When he went into the great ancestral temple, he had to ask questions about everything. The great ancestral temple was located in the state of Lu, was dedicated to the Duke of Zhou, and was the site of traditional deer sacrifice mentioned in 310, 311. Confucius' father was supposedly from Zhou. When this comment was reported to the master, his reply was, "This asking is, in fact, part of ritual." The simplest way to understand this passage is that ritual demands that one ask polite questions upon entering someone else's ancestral temple, or that one not display one's superior knowledge of ritual. As Kang Ango puts it, although Confucius knew the ritual, it was appropriate for him to ask questions about it nonetheless. This is the height of carefulness. Others read it together with 310, 311 as a subtle condemnation of the manner in which the sacrifice was being performed in Lu. As Liu Fenglu explains, from the time of the Duxi, the rulers of Lu began usurping the Zhou King prerogative of practicing the sacrifice in great ancestral temple. The employed ritual vestments, vessels, and officers of the four dynasties appropriate only the Son of Heaven and were subsequently emulated by their ministers, who also usurped the great rituals by asking about everything when he entered the great ancestral temple. Confucius avoided directly criticizing this usurpation. He pretended to ask innocently, out of ignorance, such things as, "When was the precedent for this practice established?" or "What is the justification for this practice?" in order to indicate obliquely that Lu had no right to usurp the practices of the Son of Heaven. The master said, "It is said in archery, one doesn't emphasize piercing the height of target because people's strength differ, such is the ancient way." The quoted phrase is probably a proverbial saying. Confucius' reference to strength indicates a slightly different take on the saying. Crude physical strength, the ability to pierce the height of the target, is not relevant, although it might still be a consideration. This may indicate a desire to divorce the gentlemanly practice of archery from its practical military application, while shooting with sufficient strength to pierce the opponent's leather armor was a crucial consideration. This is how the passage is understood by Zhu Xi, who makes the reference to the ideal that, after King Wu's defeat of the Shang, the Zhou gave up the practice of military force and relied solely upon the power of their virtue to maintain order. The ancients engaged in archery in order to observe a person's virtue and therefore were concerned with hitting the center of the target rather than piercing its height. The saying in the record of ritual, after King Wu defeated the Shang, he demobilized his troops and hosted an archery contest outside of the city walls, and the practice of shooting the pierced the target came to the end, refers precisely to this. Once the Zhou declined and ritual fell into disuse, however, the various states turned again to military strife, and the practice of shooting to pierce the targets was revived, hence Confucius' lament. Zigong wanted to do away with the practice of sacrificing a lamb to announce the beginning of the month. The master said, "Zigong, you regret the loss of the lamb, whereas I regret the loss of the right." According to commentators, this lamb sacrifice had originally been part of a larger ritual in state of Lu to mark the official beginning of the new month, and which, according to annals, was discontinued during the reign of Duke Wan. According to Huang Kan, although the larger ritual itself was no longer being practiced by the rulers of Lu, the practice of sacrificing the lamb was being kept alive by traditionally minded government functionaries Zigong doesn't see the point of continuing this vestigial materially wasteful practice in the absence of its original ritual context. Insisting upon the continuance of this practice, however, is Confucius' way of mourning the loss of the original rite and keeping its memory alive, which in his view is worth the cost of an occasional lamp. The valuing of ritual property over pragmatic or financial considerations link this passage to 313 and the fact that Lu, as the inheritor of Zhou culture, still preserved at least the forms of the ancient rites, links it to 3.9 and 3.14. The master said, if in serving your Lord you are careful to observe every detail of ritual property, people will think you obsequious. Ritual practice had so degenerated by Confucius' age that a proper ritual practitioner was viewed with a suspicion or disdain. As many commentators note, an example of observing every detail of ritual property is found in 9.3, where Confucius stubbornly insists upon bowing before ascending to the stairs to have an audience with a ruler, as ritual demands, rather than following the more casual contemporary practice of bowing after ascending the stairs. Such archaic manners were no doubt received by his contemporaries with precisely the sort of amusement or cynicism mentioned here. Duke Ding asked, how should a lord employ his ministers? How should a minister serve his lord? Confucius replied, a lord should employ his ministers with ritual, and ministers should serve their lord with dutifulness. Again, we have a general observation about ritual and virtue that probably has a more specific target as well. As Jia Hong explains, in the Annals of Master Yan, we read, only by means of ritual can one govern a state. Ritual is the tool employed by the former kings when they considered titles and social distinctions and thereby eliminated the seeds of disorder. Duke Ding was the king of ruler who held the blade of the sword and offered the handle to his enemies. And therefore, Confucius wants him to protect himself by means of ritual. The three families were the type of ministers of whom one might say, the tale is too big to wag, and therefore Confucius wishes to instruct them in the ways of dutifulness. That master said, the cry of osprey expresses joy without becoming litigious and expresses sorrow without falling into excessive pathos. The cries of osprey is the first of the odas and sometimes stands in the metonymically for the odas as a whole. There are two equally plausible interpretations of this passage, depending upon whether one thinks that is the text of Ode 1 in particular or the music of the Ode that is being praised. The text describes a young gentleman longing for a passionately seeking out by a beautiful, virtuous young woman. Although originally the young woman in question was probably the anonymous subject of a peasant folk song, in the commentarial tradition that grew up around the Odes, she became associated with the royal consort of King Wan, and the poem thus come to be seen as a model restraint, honorable relations between the sexes. Huang Kan, for one, relies upon the text of Ode 1 to gloss this passage. The mere prospect of joy in meeting this chastity woman is why the gentleman loves to pursue her, is not because he lusts after her beauty. Tossing and turning at night, he thinks of her. He experiences sorrow at the fact that nowhere in this world can he find the person of his dreams, but doesn't allow this sorrow to diminish his affection for her. Kong Angua, on the other hand, understands this passage as a referring to the music of the Ode. Expressing joy without becoming licentious, expressing sorrow without falling into excessive pathos, refers to the perfect harmony in either case. We see in the Odes the perfect balance of emotion and restraint that characterized the gentleman. Duke Ai asked Zaivo about the altar to the soil. Zaivo replied, the clans of Shia sovereigns used the pine tree, the Shang people used the cypress tree, and the Zhou people used the chestnut tree. It is said that they wanted to instill fear in the people. Having been informed of this, the master remarked, one doesn't try to explain what is over and done with. One doesn't try to criticize what is already gone, and one doesn't try to censor that which is already past. The Annals tells us that the altar to the soil in the states of Lu was destroyed by fire during the fourth year of reign of Duke Ai. This is probably the reason for his questioning of Zaiwu, who at the time was apparently being employed by the Duke as a ritual specialist. In his answers, Zaiwu is playing upon a graphic pun between Li Chestnut and Li Fear. Ave. There are many ways to understand this passage. Perhaps the simplest interpretation is that of Kong Angua and others who see it is a revoke of Zaibu's reckless speculation. Different states use different trees to mark their altars because of variation in local growing conditions. To derive significance from a pun, as Zaibu does it both foolish and insulting to the ancients. Alternately, Confucius saw Zaibu's comment as being critical of the Zhou and thus a violation of ritual property, especially when speaking to one of the Zhou's direct descendants, Duke Ai. Perhaps more interesting are interpretations that see this exchange as a coded reference to current affairs. In addition to their sacrificial function, altars to the soil doubled as sites of public execution. Some commentators see the Duke's question as an oblique way of suggesting that he used force against those in the states who oppose him, and Zaivo's answers as an implicit approval of this strategy. There is some variation in which commentators identify as the specific players in this drama, but the explanation of Li Baonan is representative. It seems to me that which is already past refers to the actions of Ji Pingzi. Pingzi didn't act as a minister should, even going so far as to force Duke Zhao from power. No doubt Duke Ai saw this past action of Pingzi's as the root of his current troubles, and wished to announce his crime in order to bring punishment down upon his descendants. This is an example of trying to censor what is already past. However, the loss of favor experienced by the ducal house and development of real power into the hands of ministers was not brought about in a single day. Duke Ai doesn't realize that one should employ one's ministers in accordance with ritual, and furthermore, he wasn't yet capable of employing Confucius. Instead, he impatiently wants to make a show of power in order to vent his anger, and thinks he can rely upon this to recapture his lost power and influence. This, of course, will not work at all, and this is why the master tries to restrain him with his comment. The master said Gangzong's vessel was of a small capacity. Someone asked, do you mean that he was frugal? The master replied, Guan maintained 3 separate residencies and had a separate staff member for each duty. How could he be called frugal? Well then, do you mean to say that Guanzong understands ritual? The master replied, the Lord of States erects a wall in front of his gate, and Guan did the same. The Lord of a state, when entertaining other lords, has a stand upon which to place the drinking cups after the toast, and Guan also had one of these. If Guan understood ritual, who doesn't understand it? Qi refers literally to a ritual vessel, and Confucius' helpfully obtuse questioner is apparently taking his statement at face value. Perhaps Confucius means that Guanzong was frugal and used small, unelaborated ritual implements, or perhaps that he used small ritual vessels because this is what was ritually proper to do. Both questions gave Confucius an opportunity to remark upon Guanzong's moral failings, and to make it clear that he means key in the metaphorical sense we saw in 212, a person who is narrow, specialist, or technician. Guanzong was a 7th century BCA statesman who encouraged Duke Huan of Qi to dispense with the traditional Zhou feudal state of structure and helped him organize Qi along more technocratic, efficient lines. This caused Qi to become quite powerful economically and militarily, allowing Duke Huan to officially subordinate other Zhou states under his rule and thus become the first of the officially recognized hegemons. Although Confucius expresses admiration for Guanzong in 1416-1417, at a deeper level he disapproves of his narrowly pragmatic approach and floating of traditional norms and situations. The master was discussing music with the Grand Music Master of Lu. He said, "What can be known about music is this: when it first begins, it resounds with a Confucian variety of notes, but as it unfolds, these notes are reconciled by means of harmony, brought into tension by means of counterpoint, and finally woven together in a seamless whole. It is in this way that music reaches its perfection." Music thus serves as a model or metaphor for the process of self-cultivation, starting in Confucian, passing through many phases and culminating in a state of Wu-wei perfection. A border official from Town of Yi requested an audience with the master, saying, "I have never failed to obtain an audience with the gentlemen who have passed this way." Confucius' followers thereupon presented him. After emerging from the audience, the border official remarked, "You disciples, why should you be concerned about your master's loss of office? The world has been without the way for a long time now. The heaven intends to use your master like the wooden clapper for a bell." Most commentators take this as a reference to Confucius' loss of the office of criminal judge in the state of Lu. This is presumably the reason that Confucius and his disciples are leaving the state. The ability of the border official to see Confucius through mission is taken by many commentators as an indication that he is a sage in hiding, a virtuous man who has taken a lowly position in order to protect himself in chaotic and unvirtuous time. The bell referred to is the kind used either by itinerant collectors and transmitters of folk songs or functionaries who circulated around the countryside, promulgating official announcements. In either case, the border official's point is thus that heaven has deliberately caused Confucius to lose his official position so that he might wander through the realm, spreading the teachings of the way and waking up the fallen world. The master said of Shah music, "It is perfectly beautiful and also perfectly good." He said of the Wu music, "It is perfectly beautiful but not perfectly good." The Shah was the court music of Sage King Shan, and the Wu the music of King Wu, the Zhou king responsible for overthrowing the last of the Shan kings, the evil Zhao. Hong Kong plays on the standard graphic pun between joy and music, engrossing this passage. All of the myriad things in the world felt joy when Shan succeeded Yao, and Shan followed the people's will in accepting the office. His orchestral music thus harmonized with the spirit of times, and this is why the master calls it perfectly beautiful. The succession occurred with purple bows and deference, without the slightest violation of the principles of behavior, and this is why the master calls it perfectly good. All the world felt joy when King Wu followed the people's will in attacking Zhao. His orchestral music thus harmonized with the spirits of times, and this is why the master calls it perfectly beautiful. However, a minister attacking his lord represents a violation of principles of behavior, and this is why he says that it is not perfectly good. The idea is that one's moral character is apparent in the music one creates. King Wu found it necessary to resort to force in deposing King Zhou rather than obtaining the world through Wu Wei, as did Shun, because of a slight flaw in his character that is revealed in his music and apparent to the subtle ears of Confucius. For the idea of music revealing one's character, see 1429. And for additional comments on Confucius' view of the Shah music, see 714. The master said, someone who lacks magnanimity when occupying high office, who is not respectful when performing ritual, and who remains unmoved by sorrow when overseeing mourning rites, how could I bear to look upon such person? Huang Kang observes that this passage is meant to criticize the unvirtuous rulers of Confucius' age. In 310, Confucius wished to avoid the sight of egregious violation of proper ritual form. Here, he is disgusted by the prospect of form unaccompanied by emotional substance.